Okay, good morning, everybody. All right, let me try again. Good morning, everybody. Okay, great, much better. Great to see you again. We're going to continue the conversation we had yesterday about management practices, and the main question that we're going to address today is why does management vary across firms? If you remember yesterday, I left you with a couple of findings. The first one was that the evidence collected so far suggests that there is a very strong relationship between the adoption of management practices and firm performance across many dimensions that include both productivity, profitability, survival, and so forth. However, I also left you with another finding, which is that management practices, the adoption of management practices, also varies quite a bit, both across countries and within countries. And this is true also once you focus on a very large sample within the United States. This is the graph that shows across 50,000 plans in the United States, large variations in the quality of management. So this leaves us with a puzzle. Because if these practices are really so easy, and I showed you several examples, we're talking about basic stuff, why is it so hard to adopt them? And here the reference, this is something that, the adoption actually was assumed to be frictionless several years ago in a key paper by Michael Porter, where he was stating that, in a sense, operational effectiveness should not be a basis for competitive advantage because it can be copied in a way, and it could be easily imitated by competitors. So what I want to do with you today is explore 4 different buckets of explanations that have been proposed for this variation in management practices across firms. And you will see that, unfortunately, there isn't just one single reason. This is not a problem that can be attributed just to one factor. It's actually quite complex. And so I'm going to go over with you the evidence that has been assembled so far by my team as well as many other researchers on the reasons why management varies across firms. These 4 buckets are basically, the logic goes as follows. First of all, it seems from the data we seem to understand that there is a lack of awareness, meaning that sometimes companies or managers don't actually know where they are relative to the frontier. They might be in the interior of this productivity frontier, and they don't know that they're behind. The second one is that sometimes they know they're behind, but they might not have the skills. Not everybody has the luxury to go to business school. In some instances, even going to high school is a luxury. And as you will see, management is a complement to numeracy and literacy skills. And so that's another issue. The third type of explanation is that sometimes you're behind. You might have the skills to improve, but you might not have the incentives. And yesterday, we started talking about the role of competition, for example. The fourth one, it's where I think there is a lot of activity right now in sort of pinning it down empirically. It's this idea that you're behind, you have the skills to improve, you might even be well motivated to improve and have the correct set of incentives, but the organization doesn't follow. It's very hard to convince people to follow you and sort of change their ways of doing. Okay? And these are the organizational frictions. So I'm going to show you evidence that speaks to these 4 factors. Let me start with awareness. And I want to start with something that I think would be familiar to many of you, which is this idea of, this is the book Moneyball. I think I'm in a city where people know about baseball, I hope. But if you recollect the story here, this is a story of a new set of skills, effectively, that were introduced in a new context. And for some time, there was quite a resistance in the sense that the idea of applying systematic analysis to the value of different players was not something that was believed to really make a difference in a sports setting. Because, the way of doing things was considered to be already optimal. We have a version of Moneyball in our survey in the sense that at the end of the management survey, we ask managers the following question. excluding yourself, how well managed would you say your firm is on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is worst practice, 5 is average, and 10 is best practice? So I'm going to ask the room, where do you think the mode of this distribution is? What do you think people replied? 7, 9. Wow, we are in Chicago after all. Okay, go ahead. No, nobody below 9? 7? 5? Who said 5? Okay, this is a distribution. Okay, so you were right? You are a very sincere person, but most of the people were not. And I don't know if this is sincerity or if it's really a miscalculation, but most of the managers that we spoke with actually believed that their firms were doing quite well. And if you think that average would be around 5, you can see that most of the distribution is shifted to the right. The other thing that we noticed is that whereas the management scores that we discussed yesterday, the one that was collected through interviews, correlated with measures of performance, this self-assessed management score has actually 0 correlations with external measures of firm performance. And so I think this is interesting in that it suggests that perhaps one lever through which you can improve management across companies would be to simply improve their self-assessment and improve this benchmarking exercise. So there have been several studies that have addressed this issue of belief. Where do you think you are in terms of the scale of management quality? I think this is an interesting study conducted in Vietnam, where they randomized a simple information intervention, where they just told across 300 small and medium enterprises in Vietnam, they just discussed the benefits of quality management, which is one of the subsets of the management practices that we discussed. And what they found is, first of all, there was a vast heterogeneity in the beliefs across managers, what they thought quality management could do for them. Smaller mistakes were made among educated managers. But secondly, a simple intervention of 40 minutes and information debriefing with government officials seems to have shifted these beliefs quite significantly. And so companies that were treated to this information debriefing seem to be more likely to adjust their beliefs on the benefits of quality management, adopt quality management, and improve their performance. I think this is really interesting because if you think about it, this is just a conversation, right? It's 40 minutes conversation. Similar type of intervention is something that, rather than running from the government, runs through these informal networks of entrepreneurs and managers. I don't know how familiar you are with this organization called YPO, Young President Organization. Have you ever heard of it? This is one very large network of managers and entrepreneurs in the US and globally, which serves this function of gathering business people together to talk about business problems as well as other questions, sometimes even family questions. And I think this is actually one type of organization that represents what researchers have tried to engineer through experiments by creating structured networks of peers. So basically, what Kai and Seidel, for example, have done in China, Chatterjee and others have done with high growth, high technology entrepreneurs in India, is to create from nothing groups of peers and create a structure for these peers to come together and talk about business. And when I first read these papers, I was a little bit skeptical, right? Because you're talking about just getting people together in a room and talk about stuff. And once you look at the results are really quite large. And they find that there are large effects, not just in the adoption of management practices, but also ultimately in the performance of the organizations that were treated to these peer interventions. I think it's interesting in the sense that we know from other research that these spillover effects, these knowledge spillovers, are actually quite small across firms. So it's that information doesn't seem to travel across firms, according to the experiments that other people have done. but they're very powerful once they go across people. And so this suggests that the adoption of management practices is, to a large extent, mediated by physical interactions with other people. So it's definitely something to consider in terms of policy interventions. And I think we need to know much more about how these knowledge flows actually happen on the ground. This is, I think, a big area of research that I hope will be developed going forward. You had a question before, sorry.
Yeah. I think I was just I remembered the other study where like one of the control statement was just like a month of diagnostic, and I guess that's sort of consistent because it made like a small effect relative to the countries, right?
It's definitely, and that's, thanks for this question, because that's helping me going to the next set of things, which is, treatment or interventions that have to do with just teaching people, for example, putting people in a classroom, like I'm doing today, by the way. But let's see. So the first thing to consider once you think about skills is the fact that management practices come hand in hand with the level of education of the workforce. So companies that have higher skilled workers and higher skilled managers also tend to be better managed. And I think this is something that relates to the fact that many of the practices that we are considering, as I was saying before, have a strong numeracy and literacy component. So it's important to have these basic skills to start with. This is a finding, this is data from our sample, but this finding of the covariation between management and skills is something that other people have also looked at. For example, this is a study by McKenzie and Woodruff, where they have looked at the relationship between some elements of management quality and skills in micro-enterprises in developing countries. And even there, they see that one of the some of the predictors of management practices is indeed the level of education of the entrepreneur himself or herself. Other people have started looking at this idea, and I think the key point is trying to understand how do you close these skill gaps? How can you, if you like, increase the levels of local skills that are available to firms? A recent paper by Andy Feng and Anna Valero, for example, is looking at the importance of local universities. So firms that are located in the proximity of universities also provide a larger pool of skilled individuals. They probably lower the skill premium, right? There is more abundance, and they show empirically that the distance to universities really matters for the intensity of skills and the quality of management practices in the firm. There is also a lot of work that has tried to transmit these skills directly through classroom environments. And a recent paper by Brun and others on the Journal of Political Economy has looked specifically at a training course in Mexico, treating more than 400 companies on training courses that had to deal with the specific needs of the company. And my accounting colleagues that are represented in the third row might be happy to know that accounting was one of the most requested skills that these entrepreneurs wanted to have. And actually, they find strong effects in terms of the benefits of these accounting courses, as well as other marketing and sort of other aspects of management courses. However, interestingly, there is a lot of heterogeneity. So teaching these management skills in a classroom is actually very hard. And the transmission seems to be much harder than what you would do by just talking to people face-to-face, visiting a factory, if you remember the Marshall Plan experiment that we discussed yesterday. One other way through which, however, management seems to diffuse is through acquisition. So one of the stylized facts that I think you brought up yesterday was this idea of multinationals as being a vector for diffusion of management practices. Once you look at the data, this is our management survey data, cut across countries according to whether the firm is a domestic firm. This is the blue bar at the bottom, or whether the firm is a foreign multinational. And what you see from this graph is that foreign multinationals tend to be better managed regardless of the country in which they are located. Obviously, this is a selection effect in part because in order to expand abroad, you need to be above a certain threshold of quality. But it's really interesting to see how the diffusion of management practices is somehow much easier. But there is much less friction for a multinational to sort of transplant what they're doing across boundaries. So the key question is understanding how they're doing it, what's really happening within these firms.
Sorry, can't you compare with domestic multinationals?
You can do that too. Yeah.
There is a gap.
There is still a gap. I mean, it depends. So there is this paper that I think you know about U.S. multinationals around the world that I wrote with Nick and John, where we show that there are also differences according to the nationality of the multinational. And so what you see is that the gap between domestic and foreign multinationals will depend on the country of origin and the country of location of the subsidiary. But in general, I think what this tells us is that there is something that is happening within the boundaries of the firm that is really powerful for the transmission of managerial knowledge. And so it's something to definitely to understand. Another way in which we think about these spillover effects is not so much within the boundaries of the firm, but in the proximity of firms. So some of you might know of this work done by Greenstone, Holbrook, and Moretti, which looks at $1 million plans. So $1 million plans is basically the idea, I don't know if you followed, Amazon, right, shopping for a new headquarters, and different states competing for Amazon headquarters, providing tax subsidies and so forth. Well, in this paper, what they did is that they exploited this competition across states to estimate the causal effect of the location of these new plants to see what was the effect on the local productivity, on the productivity of the other firms that were surrounding these $1 million plants. So this is a way through which you spill over effects across firms in the proximity of these $1 million plans. And in a recent paper, what a team of researchers has done, they have extended this work on spillovers by looking directly at the way in which the location of these $1 million plants affects the quality of management practices in firms that surrounding these new plants. These are typically multinational. Think about Toyota creating a new factory, for example. So following extending this work by Greenstone, Holbrook, and Moretti, for example, you can see, one specific example would be Toyota, shopping around to see where they would put their new factory. And from newspapers and other data sets that researchers have found out, you can compare the effects of this Toyota factory in Huntsville and compare it to what Clarksville, which is a comparable location, experienced in terms of management quality and productivity. And so the effects suggest a couple of things. The first is that when one of these $1 million plants opens, there is a significant effect on the quality of management practices of plants located in the proximity of this $1 million plant, and as well as a smaller and insignificant change in TFP, but a strong effect on employment growth. However, these effects are focused specifically for the types of plants that can potentially have an inflow of managers from the $1 million plants to the plant itself. So meaning you can calculate across different countries from additional data the extent to which industries have flows of manager going from one industry to another. and you can understand you know what's the industry of the $1 million plant that has opened, and then you can see that the effect of this $1 million plant is very strong when managers can actually travel across different plants. Yes?
Quick question on that finding. Do they see that in the initial effect of like Toyota coming in would strip the top quality managers from local firms to get there?
Yeah.
So this assumes that some managers go to Toyota, learn stuff, and then
Exactly.
struggle, right?
Yeah.
Would an initial effect be to actually like top?
So in the paper, they don't find any differences in terms of pre-trends or differences before the plants open. Yeah. It seems to be all on the positive.
Yeah.
And it takes also a while. So I'm not going to show this now because we don't have time, but it's an effect that sort of maxes out after 2 years and then sort of declines. So it takes some time for these flows of information to reach the surrounding plants. The type of explanations that I'd like to focus on now have to do with incentives. And again, we had some questions already yesterday about the importance of incentives. And one of the key incentives that companies face to improve themselves, when is it that companies improve themselves? Well, typically once they face competition, right? And there is a large literature that has looked at the importance of competition for productivity, starting from Syverson and going to, this is just a very selected subsample of the literature. What we know in the data is that when we ask managers a very basic question, which is how many competitors they face, we know that companies that answer, the answer to this question that they have a lot of competitors versus those that are basically monopolists, they tell us that, we see from the data that the management quality seems to vary with this level of competition. This is a very crude metric, of course. So let me just tell you about a little bit of, a couple of studies that have looked at this role of competition in a way that is a little bit more sophisticated. The first paper is a paper that looks at the China shock as a proxy for competition. And so, as you know, the entry of China in the WTO created a massive growth of Chinese exports, which, however, varied by industry across the United States. And so in this paper, they used the China shock as basically as a competition shock. And what they see is that in industries that were more exposed to Chinese competition, you see an increase in management practices, as well as a sort of retooling of the companies becoming also more technologically intensive. Of course, there is so much work right now on the China shock that also shows the negative impacts of the shock in terms of unemployment and all that. But for the specifics, I think this is the evidence that we have is that there are negative effects as well as this, if you like, adaptations towards better management practices and higher levels of technology. The second one looks at the role of competition in the context of a sector that we will discuss in more detail tomorrow, which is healthcare. And here you have to, I'm going to take you to the UK, where, under the mid-2000 reforms, there has been a lot of changes in the number of hospitals that were closed across the country. So there was a push for the reduction of the number of hospitals for budgetary reasons. However, in this paper, what they exploit is the fact that the closure of a hospital is also a very highly politically sensitive event, meaning that in countries within the UK where there was more competition between Labour and Conservative parties, it was also much harder to close a hospital. And that's because by closing a hospital, you basically make a lot of people unhappy. That's not something that your voters really like. And so what they used is the fact that there was variation in the number of hospitals across counties within the UK, which was driven by this political competition, right? As they used that as an instrument for competition. And what they find is that hospitals that were more exposed to competition not only tended to have better clinical outcomes, but also higher levels of management practices. So just a couple of studies that have tried to model the causal effect of competition on management. Something that relates more closely to the United States and has to do with the institutional setting rather than the competitive environment per se is the introduction of right-to-work regulations. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but this is a highly topical issue. And what is a right-to-work regulation? Well, basically, it's something that allows workers to join and work for a company without paying dues to unions. So in a sense, this sort of breaks the relationship between unions and workers. And it's something that was topical issues across different states, and highly debated question, in the sense that there was, from a business perspective, several businesses claiming that this gave them more flexibility in the way they could manage their workforce. But obviously, this creates also other problems for the unionization and sort of the aggregation of workers. In this study, what they used was the fact that they had measured management practices in two different time periods, 2005 and 2010. 2010 and 2015. And some of the states within this time period, in particular Michigan and Indiana, had switched to this right-to-work statutes. And so what they did is they compared the change in management practices in states that changed to the right-to-work areas and states that didn't. And what they find is that places where there was more flexibility, if you like, and less dependence on the unions, these plants experienced a change in the management score. So they had a higher level of the management score, which was, however, only limited to incentives. There was pretty much nothing in terms of the more operational parts of the score. And so this suggests that, to some extent, the institutional environment is one of the components that might help to explain variation in practices across firms. They also do a similar exercise looking, rather than across states, looking at the differences between states that had already passed this right-to-work regulations, but looking at plans that were at the borders of states that had passed the regulations versus those that didn't. It's sort of a regression discontinuity approach, and looking at the effects across neighboring plans in neighboring states as a way to control for possible unobservables. And they find similar effects. So changes in incentive practices, higher practices for counties that were on the right-to-work side of the borders versus those that didn't.
Does this lead to more efficiency or not?
So I think that the effects on the efficiency are not as large as the effect on the practices, which is something really interesting. So there is a change in practices, but not necessarily a change in productivity. Yeah. Okay. So the last piece on this issue of incentives has to do with ownership. And basically, one key finding that emerges from the data is the relationship between management practices and different types of ownership. I think it's, for those of you who come from family businesses or have been exposed to family businesses, I don't know how that resonates with you, but one of the stylized facts that emerges from this data is that firms that have either a family or a founder CEO, so firms that are family-owned and have a family CEO, or firms that are founder-owned and have a founder CEO, they systematically appear to have worse management practices. Now, why is this interesting? It's interesting because the vast majority of companies in the world are actually, have this sort of corporate governance. And it's interesting because it seems that it's really the composition of ownership and control that matters for the management score. And in particular, what you see is that companies that are family-owned but have an external manager, a professional manager, they are actually doing much better in terms of their management score and in terms of their productivity. So this is suggesting that there is something specific to this combination of family and of ownership and control that prevents companies from investing in this sort of professionalization and adoption of management practices. Why is it the case? Well, there are different explanations here. I can think about two broad buckets. The first one has to do with selection. And in particular, what we know from these companies, from additional research that has been done on family and founder CEO companies, is that often the management of these organizations is chosen on the basis of the gender and order of birth. And in particular, if you're a man and first son, you typically get the company, and not so much in terms of competence. So this creates selection effects in the sense that often people who are chosen to run these companies might not be the best managers available. So it's a restriction of the pool of talent. And Daniela Lemos and Renata Skur, who are two researchers that have looked in detail at these issues of transmission of control and nepotism within family firms, and sort of find evidence that supports this idea that selection is very, very different in family firms. The second one is, I think, more intriguing, at least from my perspective, which suggests that perhaps what's going on here is an issue of preferences. So we think about family firms and family CEOs and founder CEOs. Effectively, they should be the most motivated to maximize the profits and the performance of their organizations because they are residual claimants. Basically, it should all go to them. But in these companies, there is a possibility also that for family and founder CEOs, it's actually hard to divide control and to have professional managers coming and telling them what to do. In other words, there is a sort of a preference for control, which Raghu-Rajan modeled a while back in an interesting paper, where basically you invest in management practices that make you less relevant as a CEO only when you have to, which meaning when you have to raise funds, when you have to bring external investors, for example. But if you can avoid to do it, you basically just run the show yourself. And in fact, what we see in a study that we conducted among Italian firms, where family companies are very diffuse and this concentration of ownership and control is very diffuse, we see that there is a systematic difference, not only in terms of management practices, but also in terms of delegation and trust in external managers. Meaning we see that choosing to not to rely on professionalized management practices comes together also with hiring managers that are of lower skill levels, trusting these managers less, so retaining more of the control. And essentially it comes down to a selection between what we say it's either fidelity or performance. So you basically choose to run the companies with your buddies rather than choosing to run them with the best managerial capital available to you. And I think that this is actually quite a salient problem for family companies more generally, and something that this tension between wanting to grow and wanting to retain control is a tension that they face, especially in phases of growth and expansion. And sure.
On that point, is that kind of fitted, like what I've observed is satisficing versus maximizing?
Yeah.
So in some sense, they're effectively destroying value if you think about like the cost of capital and what they actually return. But I had clients, they pulled $500,000 out of the business every year. They were cash flow positive. They did what they had to do, but if you actually looked at their cost of capital and their profits, they were destroying economic value, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say it as probably in their objective function, there is more than just money. Yeah. And you can think about it in terms of living the quiet life, being your own boss. You can think about it in terms of providing a job to your son who might not otherwise find a job elsewhere, for example. But I think that there are multiple objectives that you might pursue, and that is something that affects your organizational choices. Yes.
What do you think about the interpretation that some of these family-owned firms might be too small to warrant a fixed cost of professional manager?
I think that often you see that there is actually family firms that are quite large and are still running their companies as if they were small. So it's clear that there is a cost that you incur if you are of a certain size and if you're thinking about growing. I think your reasoning makes sense. But empirically, we see firms that are way beyond that threshold and still haven't been professionalized. And that's a real issue.
Sorry,
Yeah.
One slide back.
Yeah.
Is it significant, the difference between dispersed shareholders and private equity?
No, it's not. They look quite similar.
But wouldn't you expect, and this is, if you ask Steve Kaplan, who said that private equity is always the best.
You ask him.
No, I tell you that what it says is more concentrated, etc. So it's surprising that it doesn't come higher than dispersed shareholders.
I think that, I really don't have any prior on where they should be. Typically, dispersed shareholder firms, these are public firms, so they have, they've come over some thresholds in order to be public firms and survive. So it's a selected sample there too. And in practice, they look quite similar. The interesting thing about private equity firms is that it's not just about incentives. So the reason why they are up high in our ranking is not just because they provide these high-powered incentives to their managers, but it's also in the types of practices, on the operational practices that they use. Mm-hmm. And in some earlier work, we've seen that these practices are actually, and again, it's not just selecting on companies that are already good, but introducing practices after they acquire organizations. Yeah?
What about a possible explanation where maybe the CEO is improving the productivity of the firm, but not due to skills that are measured by these management practices? I'm thinking like tech firms like Apple or Facebook have, even when they got to a big enough size that would warrant the cost of a professional manager, the original CEO, which is often more of someone who was good at building technology than someone who was especially good at managing people, stayed in charge, maybe because having the CEO is someone who's good with technology.
Yeah. I think that you're pointing to an interesting piece, which is it might be that the best way to manage a company varies according to the stage of the organization. And if you're a small company, you can do everything by sight. You probably don't need too much bureaucracy. You just do things yourself. Or if you're in a moment of turbulence and you need to react quickly, perhaps you don't want to rely too much on processes. I think there is an element of that for sure. However, I would also say that after a certain scale of operations, if you don't have processes, things are likely to go belly up. So, and the companies, clearly the companies that we have in our sample are companies that, beyond 50 employees, between 50 and 5,000, they sort of need these practices. But I agree, there might be other things that other types of companies that are not necessarily in our sample. Yeah. The other piece here is also this idea that, so far I basically talked about managers who are either not aware, maybe they're not capable, these lazy managers that maybe don't have the incentives. But, let's face it, even for organizations that want to change and want to professionalize, I don't know how many of you have had consulting experience or have actually tried to change things in a firm. This is really hard, right? Even if you know exactly what you want to do, and you're motivated, you have to do it, change is really hard. So one class of explanations for this organizational inertia, why is change hard, has been proposed by Robert Gibbons and Rebecca Henderson, who basically talk about the adoption of management practices in a way that is really interesting. What they say is that the fundamental problem, why is it hard to change? It's because it's very hard to write formal contracts that would allow to explain all the different contingencies that need to happen for change and sort of reward people on the basis of their behavior. These are basically a situation of incomplete contracts. And what they think here is that the idea that companies that are able to be better managed are able to substitute these formal contracts with what they call relational contracts. So I want to tell you a little bit more about this. They define relational contracts as understandings that the parties share about their roles in and rewards from cooperating together, which cannot be enforced by a court. Okay? Specific example that I hope will clarify what we're talking about here. This is not high-level philosophy. It's something quite basic. How many of you know about the Andon Code? Okay, so the Andon Code is a process that has been pioneered and it's used in Toyota factories, where basically workers that are on the shop floor can, at any point in time, stop the production line whenever they see a production defect. That's, in broad terms. You are on the shop floor and you can stop the production line. Okay, this is part of lean management. If you think about what are the preconditions that need to exist for workers to be able to pull the Andon cord, it's actually a little bit more sophisticated. It's not just a matter of pulling the cord. First of all, the supervisors need to believe that the workers will pull the Andon cord only when they see a problem, and not because they want to get out of the shop floor and get a coffee, for example, right? It's not because they want to shirk, but it's because they see a problem. And also, often what happens is that once a worker pulls the Andon cord, they will see a problem. They will also often propose a suggestion for improvement. Sometimes that suggestion for improvement might even make their job redundant. So sometimes, making an observation of how the company might be more productive could actually lead for the job of these production workers to become redundant. On the other hand, the workers have to believe that the supervisors will recognize a potential problem when the Andon cord is pulled. So they have to believe that the supervisor is not going to punish the worker because they raised a problem. And at the same time, that they will implement these improvements or recognize the problems without necessarily cutting their jobs. And at the same time, that the supervisor will accept the authority of the work teams to make some shop floor decisions. Some of these adjustments are made locally by the teams. They're not made by the supervisor. So this is the type of mutual understanding that need to exist, both at the end of the managerial or supervisor level and at the worker level, for something like the Andon cord to be implemented. And if you think about it, this is, how do you specify all the conditions for this to happen in a contract? How do you reward it? This is a type of relational contract, the way in which Gibbons and Henderson think about it. In their paper, they also mentioned the difficulties that GM had when they tried to become Toyota and implement some of the aspects of lean, including the Andon cord. And basically, they say that one of the key obstacles that GM faced is the fact that the workers didn't trust that management was going to implement these practices without firing them. There was a profound distrust between workers and managers that sort of prevented these practices from being adopted. And so in a sense, the trust between workers and supervisors is one of the key enablers of adoption. And I think here, we don't have time to go into that, but there is a rich literature that speaks to why trust varies across countries, why it varies within countries. And I've done also some work looking at the importance of regional differences in trust within countries. But again, this is one area that I think really needs to have much more study and much more research. Some of the things that we think about, for example, is what are the drivers of trust? What shapes trust? So I won't have the time to go into that now, but some of the studies that I'm doing right now looks specifically at the importance of managerial time and managerial attention, and in particular the way in which CEOs spend their time as one of the key inputs to culture. So how CEOs vary in the way in which they spend time with their workers and how they spend time coordinating versus doing stuff all seem to have to play a role for the adoption of management practices. And my favorite example on what not to do if you want to make sure that your company is well run is effectively being a micromanager, always being there and sort of substituting, rather than trusting your employees sort of sleeping on the shop floor and doing things that other people should be doing. So this is, I know that one of my colleagues at HBS says that failure is overdetermined. So there might be many different reasons why Tesla is in trouble. But if you look at the ways in which, the difficulties that they had in sort of in adopting management practices, I really do believe that there is something that has to do with managerial behavior at the top, rather than just sort of financial issues. Okay, so I want to conclude to leave us time for some questions. The three main points here is, first of all, we started with this observation of wide variation in management practices across firms and countries. The second point is that there are broad categories to explain these differences. Some of them look quite behavioral, to be honest, just not knowing where you are and how much you are behind. But others have to do with skills and training, the incentives faced by the managers, and then more fundamentally the organizational frictions, these mutual understandings between workers and managers. And I think that there is still a lot to do to credibly identify the relative importance of each. But the one point that I hope you will take away is this idea that this diffusion of practices is not frictionless. It's not really the idea of just pulling pulling a light switch on and off, but there is a lot of complexity even in adopting the basics. And so my suggestion would be, rather than just bypassing the basics and taking them for granted, really trying to understand, focusing on the basic before going for more complex aspects of management. And in particular, thinking about the direct and visible importance that leadership plays in fostering the adoption of management practices. So I'll leave you here, and we have about 10 minutes for questions. Thank you. Yes?
I know that sometimes the United States antitrust authorities would be very suspicious if you told them your plan is, hey, let's get up all the competitors in this industry together and have them discuss things. I know antitrust action has been taken against some information sharing agreements on the grounds that was possibly facilitating collusion. To what extent might anti-competitive behavior be driving the results in the peer-to-peer experiment that you
the type of experiments that I discussed were done among micro-entrepreneurs or small firms, where I don't think there would be this consideration of these antitrust considerations. Okay. These are companies that are way behind the frontier, and there's still a lot that they have to do to become a threat to competitiveness.
Okay. Well, I did notice that there was still and then there's still analyses of market power in local towns, with the rationale being even if these are small firms, if it's also a small market, they still have substantial market power.
Yeah.
I think Bresnahan and Rees show that there does seem to be market power if you're a duopoly dentist in a very small town.
Yeah. It's interesting. I don't think that the papers that I've seen so far have looked at that explicitly, and I don't know the extent to which maybe they were talking about competitive arrangements. I think the way they designed the teams were so that they would be heterogeneous in their industries. They wouldn't be direct competitors. But I think it's something interesting to study.
Right.
So when we talk about standardized management practices, they at times can take away flexibility.
Yeah.
And managers may like that flexibility.
Yeah.
And I think that can be one of the major frictions, where you don't have the incentives, but at the same time, in certain situations, you don't have the benefits because you are trying to standardize something which may not work well. So, is there research on this topic that you can talk about?
In terms of how the managers perceive it? Yeah. I don't know if there is systematic large sample research on this. I can tell you that from case study evidence, this is definitely one of the main issues, right? Which is, effectively, I think I was answering a question yesterday on this. By implementing a process, you are asking a person to modify their behavior. And rather than doing what is good for them locally, you're asking them to adapt to a behavior which may be beneficial at a system level, but not at individual level, right? We should distinguish two different cases. There is one case in which I think that this private resistance is detrimental to the company, and the key there is trying to understand how do you overcome it. And I would say that the research that I've seen and the work that I've done is that often you overcome it using psychological tools rather than money, which I think is really interesting, right? So you create a different religion, for example, that has to do with the processes and is much broader than just doing your job. That's where culture really matters. There is a second aspect to your question, which is sometimes the practices that we look at here might not be good for the company. And the typical example is innovation. So I think that the jury is still out there as to whether are these practices that are just good to optimize on something that already exists, or to what extent can you use processes also to discipline the innovation function. And I think that needs to be researched much more. Yeah.
A lot of the examples you gave were about optimizing management practices in traditional retail or more physical good industries. Can you speak a little bit about the research being done about management practices in the knowledge economy?
So the first comment I would make is that not enough. And definitely there is so much to do in that area. And I don't know exactly what you mean by knowledge economy, but I can refer to a pilot that I'm doing with clinical research labs in Harvard, which is still unpublished. But we really wanted to push this idea that management would matter. And so what's the most hostile environment you can think of? Academics, right? So we went to 120 clinical research labs that do basic science in Harvard, and we did this survey. What we're finding is actually really interesting. It's still unpublished, as I said, but there is no difference in terms of productivity of these labs. First of all, there is a lot of variation in the way in which these labs are managed. Fact number one. Fact number two, there is no variation in terms of number of papers that are published, but there seems to be an association between management and the quality of the papers that are published in terms of citation. And the third thing, which I thought is fascinating and I want to look at much more, is in the job satisfaction of the people working in the labs, which seems to be higher when the lab has more systematic sharing processes and sharing of information. And I think that that is another area which I think would be an ideal setting for an experiment, like doing management training with scientists and seeing where that leads you. Yeah. Yeah.
I was not there yesterday, so you may have covered it already.
You missed the good stuff. Okay.
But in the context of changing management practices, what is there a study around the tools we have to do that, like technology tools?
Yeah.
And how that impacts change?
So you're talking about what's the importance of technology for change?
Of any sort of tools, and technology is a new form of tools we can use to do that.
Yeah. I really don't think that it's a technological issue. So I really think that the main problem is a problem of mindset and deciding that you want to be systematic, knowing how to do it. I've seen I've seen small rural hospitals in Zambia being super well managed with a chart that was written by hand, that was tracking infections by hand. Is that a technology that is hard to adopt? No, but it really requires a lot of discipline. Having said that, it's really interesting because I think that now with high-frequency data on employees and the ability to plot and monitor, all these visual tools are, I think, much more readily available than they might have been 10 years ago. So that's like an opportunity to understand how do you enhance the use of these tools. But my sense is that it's not just the technology part. There has to be something else that comes with it.
You had that chart up before about management practices in founder-backed companies.
Yeah.
Have you seen any difference between pure founder-backed companies or kind of self-sustained, bootstrapped versus in a venture capital environment or some kind of environment where they've got diffusion of management practices? Do you see those type of companies perform better, and is that something to back some of the premiums that venture capitalists pay, maybe?
I'm not sure. We don't have a ton of VC-backed companies in the sample, and so I don't know. That's interesting. But I do think that the effect of VCs will be highly heterogeneous according to the type of VC you're dealing with. Some VCs are very explicit about being very detached, and others, I think increasingly more to win entrepreneurs, are more and more moving towards this idea of providing a value in terms of advice. So again, something that I have not researched personally, but I think it would be really interesting to map out. Yeah. Sure, please.
Follow-up question too.
Yeah.
So you talked about mindset, and I think earlier you talked about how trust is important, one of the important things. What are the other elements and what are the other studies around change, successful change and successful mindset change?
What other studies?
What apart from trust?
What other traits?
Yeah,
or,
the traits of changing mindset successfully in an organization.
So, she does a lot of research on culture and stuff. So that's a question for her. Yeah, I think I'm focusing more. I have not looked at the psychological traits of CEOs. That's the bottom line. I think it's important to focus on the basics. I think that trust is probably the foundation for a lot of the other stuff that we usually talk about, visionary, creativity, and all that stuff. Think about, and what I observe is that this element of trust is often missing. So I don't want to go towards more complicated models. I think we should start from the basics and, first try to crack that nut before we go into more sophisticated things. Yeah. All right. One more question. Yeah.
What is the sample size of the multinational firms? Like, are these the same firms everywhere with a high efficiency?
So interesting you say that. We have about 3,000 subsidiaries of multinational firms in the sample. And for, I think, about 2,000 of them, they actually belong. We have different plants that belong to the same parent company. And once you look at the data, you will see that there are systematic differences across the parent organizations. So again, some parent organizations are able to enforce management practices much more consistently than others. And this difference sort of maps regardless of where the plant is located. Yeah. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.